All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're digging into a pretty provocative idea. What if the path to war is literally paved with the same paper that's sitting in your wallet? We're going to break down some source material that draws a direct line from government debt and what's called soft money, all the way to global conflict. But let's start with a really basic question that honestly underpins this whole thing. What if the money you work so hard for, the money you save, isn't actually a solid store of value? What if it's just a promise? You know, a promise from a government, a promise that can be broken or, more often, just kind of quietly watered down over time. Okay, so to really get our heads around that, we need to pop the hood on our financial system. The source material we're looking at today starts by explaining the kind of hidden logic behind what it calls soft money. So, the source material lays this out as a pretty simple four-step cycle. It all starts with number one, deficit spending, right? That's just the government spending way more money than it brings in through taxes. So, to cover that gap, they move to step two, issuing debt, usually by selling government bonds. But what happens when nobody wants to buy that debt anymore? Well, that brings us to step three, monetization. This is where the central bank literally just creates new money out of thin air to buy those bonds. And that, of course, leads directly to the final step, number four, devaluation. Suddenly, there's all this new money flooding the system, but the amount of actual stuff to buy hasn't changed. So what happens? The value of every single dollar goes down. And that, my friends, is inflation. And this warning from investor Ray Dalio really hits the nail on the head. It becomes this vicious feedback loop. Think about it. The government has to pay interest on all that debt it issued. But how? The only way is to print even more money, which, as we just saw, devalues the currency, which makes the whole problem even worse. It's an incredibly fragile system, like a house of cards just waiting for someone to breathe on it. So, you might be thinking, is this just a modern problem? Well, according to the source material, absolutely not. In fact, it argues this pattern is as old as empires themselves. They call this repeating historical pattern the Great Debt Cycle. And this chart here really shows the idea in action. Just follow the flow. It starts with a new order. That's stage one. Things are good, debt is low, people are productive. But as the empire gets bigger and more powerful, it eventually hits stage three, a massive debt bubble. And from there, the argument goes, things really start to unravel. You get internal conflict, huge wealth gaps, and it all leads right to the brink of a major crisis. So the big question is, where are we right now? Well, according to this model, the source material places us squarely in stage five. And yeah, this is the most dangerous part of the whole cycle. It's defined by, you guessed it, massive debt, deep divisions at home, and the growing threat of war. If you look at history, this is the exact stage where all that financial stress just boils over and a major conflict becomes the event that completely resets the global order. Which, of course, brings us to the ultimate stress test. What happens when a system that's already buckling under its own debt has to deal with the insane pressure of a major war? Now, the source material uses a potential conflict between the US and Iran as a kind of modern case study for this. And it makes sense when you think about it. War is this gigantic, off-the-books expense. It forces a government to slam the accelerator on that debt cycle we just talked about. You're issuing tons of new debt and printing money like crazy, right at the exact moment when global trust in your system is at an all-time low. It just pushes that whole fragile system into overdrive. But why this specific conflict? Well, it all comes down to one thing: energy. The Strait of Hormuz is this tiny choke point that controls something like 20% of the entire world's oil. If you disrupt that, it's like slapping a massive energy tax on the whole world overnight. Prices would spike. And as the price of oil, a real, physical thing, goes through the roof, the purchasing power of a paper currency like the US dollar just collapses. Suddenly, in a time of war, a barrel of oil is way, way more valuable than a digital number in your bank account. And you can see the vulnerability right here on this map. I mean, look at that. This one tiny little waterway, the Strait of Hormuz, perfectly highlights a core argument from the source material. When a real crisis hits, controlling physical stuff gives you massive leverage over people who only control paper promises. Okay, so if soft money is the problem, this brings us to the other side of the coin. The source suggests that throughout history, the answer has always been hard assets. So first, let's just make sure we're on the same page with our terms. Fiat currency, what we're calling soft money, it only has value because a government says it does and because we all agree to trust that government. That's it. It's not backed by anything physical. Hard assets, on the other hand, are the complete opposite. They're real, physical things that are useful, and this is the key part, they're scarce. You can't just print more oil. You can't just print more gold. Their value comes from what they actually are. And this simple formula here really gets to the heart of the whole argument. The best way to think about it is like a pizza. The fixed asset, let's say all the gold in the world, that's the pizza. The money supply is how many slices you cut it into. Every time the government prints more money, they're just cutting the pizza into more and more slices. So your slice, your purchasing power, it just gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So if soft money is the problem, then what's the anchor in the middle of the storm? Well, in this narrative, the source points directly to gold. It's framed as the ultimate neutral asset because it exists completely outside the promises and the debts of any single country. So why gold specifically? The source lays out a few key reasons. First, there's no counterparty risk. All that means is that owning gold isn't like owning a stock or a bond, right? Those are just someone else's promise to pay you back. With gold, you hold the actual thing. It is the payment. It's also really hard to sanction. And maybe most importantly, it has held its value through the collapse of pretty much every single paper currency in all of human history. Okay, so let's bring all this down to a personal level. How do these huge macro ideas actually affect you and your money? This next part deals with what the source calls the productivity paradox. So the core idea here is that inflation isn't just some number on a screen. It's actually a massive and kind of sneaky transfer of wealth. If you're a saver and you keep your money in cash, its value is just silently getting eaten away year after year. But if you're a massive debtor, and who's the biggest debtor of all? The government. Inflation is like a secret weapon. It lets them pay back all their old debts with new, cheaper, devalued money. And this quote really says it all. Cash is trash, when its value is just evaporating every year. And that's the paradox, right? You're working harder and harder, but you're saving that money in a currency that's designed to buy you less and less over time. And this image really brings us full circle. The source's entire argument is basically captured right here. When a real crisis, like a war, actually hits, all those promises printed on paper can just go up in smoke. So what's left? What's real? It's the tangible assets, the stuff you can physically hold. That's what becomes truly valuable. And so this whole breakdown really leaves us with one final, very personal question. It's a question from the source material that's meant for you to think about. When you look at your own wealth, how much of it is actually in real assets, and how much is just resting on paper hopes?